August 1945, Luzon, the Philippines. The war was over, but the world still smelled of death and dust. Under the bleached sun, a line of exhausted Japanese women stood in silence. Their khaki uniforms were torn, their faces hollow from weeks of hiding in the jungle. Many had served as army nurses or clerks. Now they were prisoners. American soldiers moved quietly among them, not with rifles raised, but with canteens and bundles of white cloth. One soldier knelt and opened a crate. Inside, bars of soap, clean towels, and small metal basins filled with water. The women hesitated, unsure. They had been told Americans were monsters, that capture meant humiliation or death. Yet here, in the choking heat, came the scent of something they hadn't known in years: cleanliness. When one soldier gently placed a towel into a woman's trembling hands, her eyes widened. Then she bowed her head and began to cry, not from fear but from disbelief. For the first time since the war began, mercy had a face. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese Empire was collapsing. Cities burned nightly under waves of American bombers. The Imperial Navy had ceased to exist, and the last desperate defense of Okinawa had ended in slaughter. Nearly 500,000 soldiers and civilians were dead. Yet the propaganda continued. Surrender was unthinkable, and capture by the enemy was worse than death. This belief ran deep, especially among women serving the empire. Since 1942, as Japan's armies stretched across Asia, tens of thousands of women had been drawn into military service. Some were nurses and communications clerks. Others were members of the Women's Volunteer Corps or auxiliaries assigned to air defense, transport, and logistics. In the Philippines, on Guam, and across the islands of the South Pacific, they followed the army to the front lines, often enduring the same hunger, fear, and bombardment as the soldiers they served beside. Their orders were clear. If captured, they were to die rather than face dishonor. Many carried grenades or cyanide capsules. So when Japan's formal surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, the reaction among these women was not relief. It was disbelief. They had been taught that Americans would kill or defile them. Now suddenly they were told the war was over, and they were to surrender to the very enemy they had feared all their lives. Across the Pacific, the Allied advance had left thousands of stranded Japanese personnel, men and women, cut off from Tokyo's command. On Luzon, hundreds of nurses and clerks emerged from mountain caves after weeks of starvation. In Okinawa, others surrendered at field hospitals carrying wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers. They were met by U.S. forces under orders from General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, which had already begun planning how to manage the millions of prisoners expected after Japan's defeat. The task was enormous. The United States and its allies now faced an empire in ruins, 6.5 million Japanese servicemen scattered across Asia, and thousands of civilian workers who had followed them into war zones. But what truly shocked the surrendering women was not the efficiency of the American machine. It was the unexpected humanity of its soldiers. The American military had learned hard lessons from the brutality of the Pacific Campaign. The discovery of atrocities, from Bataan to Nanking, had hardened many troops. Yet, as the war ended, MacArthur's command insisted that occupation and surrender would not be an act of vengeance. It would be, in his words, the re-education of a nation. That meant restraint and even compassion toward prisoners, especially civilians and medical personnel. Thus, when female prisoners emerged from hiding, they were not executed or shamed, but registered, examined, and given food, water, and soap. To the Japanese, cleanliness had always carried moral weight, a link between purity, honor, and self-discipline. To lose that was to lose humanity itself. So when U.S. soldiers offered them soap and towels, it struck deeper than the physical gesture. It told them they were still human. The Allied relief camps were carefully organized. Japanese women were separated from men, given privacy screens for bathing, and issued simple garments. Medical officers conducted examinations to prevent disease outbreaks. The U.S. Army Medical Corps documented cases of malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition, conditions worsened by the final months of starvation warfare. American soldiers, many of them barely older than the women they guarded, performed these duties quietly, They were aware that a single misstep could confirm every fear Japan had spread through years of propaganda. But the opposite occurred. Again and again, reports described scenes of disbelief. Women staring at soap, towels, and water as if they were sacred gifts. They had expected cruelty. Instead, they were shown dignity. For the Americans, it was a chance to prove that victory could mean something higher than destruction. For the Japanese, it was the beginning of a reckoning, not with the enemy, but with their own understanding of humanity. The empire had fallen, yet from its ashes, something unexpected began to take shape. The first fragile connection between conqueror and conquered, built not on fear, but on compassion. And that compassion would soon face its first true test, as thousands more prisoners emerged from the jungles and the ruins, waiting to see whether mercy was real. In the days following Japan's surrender, American and Allied command posts across the Pacific became overwhelmed with a problem no army had faced before: how to humanely manage millions of defeated enemies. The Allied powers, under General Douglas MacArthur, launched what became one of the largest organized surrenders in history. From Burma to Manchuria, from the jungles of the Philippines to the ruins of Tokyo, Japanese troops and civilians began emerging in waves. Many were emaciated, covered in sores, or half-mad from weeks of isolation. Among them were an estimated 50,000 women, including medical auxiliaries, communication operators, and administrative clerks. Some had served directly in combat zones. Others had been stationed at military hospitals or logistics bases far behind the front. The empire had called them helpers of victory. Now they were the forgotten survivors of defeat. In the Philippines, one of the first major processing points for female POWs was established near Santo Tomas and Los Baños, former internment areas used earlier for Allied civilians. American medical officers, and many of whom had themselves been prisoners of the Japanese and now found themselves treating their former captors. Reports from U.S. Army archives describe the surreal nature of those first encounters. When Japanese nurses were told to wash and rest, they hesitated, believing it to be a trick. One interpreter later wrote, "They bowed so low they seemed ready to collapse, as if expecting punishment for breathing." But punishment never came. Instead, soldiers handed out ration tins, water canteens, soap, and hand towels. To Americans, it was a routine act of sanitation. To the Japanese, it was an unthinkable gesture of mercy, one that shattered years of indoctrination. For over a decade, Japan's military propaganda had painted Allied soldiers as beasts, enemy devils, who tortured and dishonored captives. Civilian women had been taught that surrender was spiritual death. This doctrine, known as Senjin-kun, had been drilled into every member of the imperial forces. "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner," it declared. So when American troops not only refused to harm them but provided food, medicine, and dignity, confusion spread through the ranks of the surrendered. Some women reportedly wept openly. Others refused to believe the war was over, while a few tried to commit suicide rather than face what they thought must come next. The Americans, recognizing the depth of this psychological conditioning, turned to a new weapon: humanity itself. Psychological warfare officers, many trained in anthropology and linguistics, advised units to demonstrate discipline and restraint. Acts as small as offering soap, clean clothing, or a towel became strategic tools in the wider mission of pacification. These moments, though simple, helped dismantle the myth of the inhuman enemy. In occupied zones such as Manila and Tokyo, Red Cross representatives and female military nurses were often brought forward to help calm Japanese women. They explained in Japanese that they would not be harmed, that they would be treated according to international law. Such words meant little at first, but the consistent kindness did what propaganda could not. It changed hearts. Meanwhile, the world beyond the camps was reeling. Across Asia, tens of millions were displaced. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were wastelands of radiation and ruin. In China, Korea, and the Pacific Islands, the collapse of the Japanese Empire left power vacuums and chaos. The Allies' commitment to order, and to moral high ground, was now being tested everywhere. MacArthur's headquarters understood that every gesture mattered. The United States was not only occupying Japan, it was shaping the memory of the war itself. And so, in the camps and field stations where the first POWs were processed, The quiet acts of compassion, clean towels, soap, a place to rest, carried more political weight than 1,000 speeches. They marked the beginning of what historians now call the moral reconstruction of Japan. Yet beneath this surface of civility, the legacy of war's cruelty still lingered. Many of the Japanese women carried trauma from the front, memories of bombings, disease, and loss. Some had seen their units commit atrocities. Others had nursed soldiers who died whispering loyalty to an emperor who could no longer save them. For these women, surrender brought both relief and shame. In their culture, to survive when others had perished was not triumph. It was guilt. But as the Americans continued to show restraint and dignity, that guilt slowly began to transform. It would take months, even years, for some to understand that the soap and towels they were offered were not symbols of conquest, but of cleansing, both literal and moral. The war had ended, but its ghosts still walked among them. And soon, as these encounters deepened, both victor and vanquished would find themselves changed in ways neither side had expected. The human angle, faces of defeat, to understand what those women felt, one must first imagine the collapse of a belief system. For years, the Japanese military had portrayed death in service to the emperor as the highest form of purity. Survival, especially through capture, was a stain on one's honor and family. In August 1945, when word of surrender reached isolated garrisons, disbelief swept through the ranks. Women who had marched beside the Imperial Army, as medics, typists, or Signal Corps assistants, were suddenly told to lay down arms and wait for capture. Some burned personal belongings. Others destroyed military documents to preserve secrecy even in defeat. When the Americans arrived, these women expected brutality. Instead, they saw men who looked tired, cautious, but strangely gentle. The simple act of being treated like a person again, of being handed food without being slapped, of hearing calm voices rather than shouted orders, became overwhelming. An Allied nurse later wrote, "The Japanese women would bow until their faces nearly touched the ground. They wept without sound when we gave them soap and warm water. That moment, raw, human, wordless, marked the first crack in the wall of hatred that years of war had built." The cultural angle, pride and purity, for Japanese women. Cleanliness was not just physical, it was spiritual. In Shinto tradition, purity symbolizes harmony with the divine. Filth, by contrast, represented moral and emotional corruption. During the war, as food and supplies dwindled, soldiers and auxiliaries often went months without proper hygiene. Lice infection and disease spread through camps. By 1945, many had forgotten the feel of warm water or the scent of soap. So when American soldiers offered soap and towels, the gesture struck at the deepest level of cultural symbolism. It was not merely about washing. It was an invitation to restore dignity, and yet that same act carried shame. To receive help from an enemy was humiliation. Many Japanese women wept as they washed, not only for what they had lost, but for what they were forced to accept. In their eyes, purity had been returned, but pride had been taken. Historians later described this duality as the paradox of surrender, where compassion could wound more deeply than cruelty. The psychological angle, breaking the myth when Allied. Troops entered Japanese camps, they found propaganda leaflets scattered among the ruins. They warned soldiers and civilians that Americans would torture, enslave, or dismember prisoners. Mothers were told to kill their children rather than fall into Allied hands. This propaganda was powerful, and its collapse came suddenly. As American soldiers offered food and care, disbelief turned into cognitive shock. Prisoners looked for hidden motives. Was this kindness a trick? Were they to be experimented on? Military psychologists attached to the U.S. Army later documented these reactions. They observed how Japanese POWs would sometimes test the sincerity of kindness, refusing food, bowing excessively, or trying to return gifts. Trust, they noted, took time, but it came. Slowly, the women began to accept help without fear. Some even smiled, cautiously, fleetingly. This transformation became one of the quiet victories of the Allied occupation, the unspoken dismantling of an ideology that had dehumanized both sides. The moral angle, mercy as power to the American military command. Mercy was not only moral, It was strategic. The world was watching. After the atomic bombings, the U.S. faced global scrutiny. Images of cruelty or revenge could destroy the narrative of liberation that Washington sought to project. So, every gesture, from offering towels to enforcing discipline among guards, served a purpose. It signaled to Japan and to history that the victors would not become what they had fought against. There was also a deeper lesson at play. Many soldiers who showed compassion were themselves survivors of Japanese brutality, men who had seen friends die in Bataan or Changi. For them, restraint was not weakness. It was victory of another kind. One American officer described it in his field journal. They expected hate. We gave them decency. That was the hardest thing I ever did, and the most important. Such moments revealed the thin line between vengeance and virtue, and how, in the fragile dawn of peace, morality itself became a battlefield. At the camps, soap and towels became more than supplies. They were instruments of moral diplomacy, small symbols of a world trying to wash itself clean after years of blood. And yet, beyond the humanitarian surface, these encounters were also shaping the next phase of history: occupation, reconstruction, and the redefinition of Japan's identity. The military angle, discipline after victory. By September 1945, American forces in the Pacific had achieved the unthinkable: total, unconditional victory. But the challenge that followed was not conquest, it was control. At its peak, the U.S. occupation force numbered nearly 600,000 men and women scattered across Japan and its former colonies. Maintaining discipline among such numbers, many scarred by years of combat, required exceptional leadership. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers SCAP, understood this better than anyone. He issued strict orders. There would be no looting, no revenge, and no abuse of prisoners. Every American soldier, he said, was now a representative of civilization itself. In the field, this principle was tested daily. Soldiers entered villages that had once cheered Japan's imperial expansion. Now they faced starvation, rubble, and suspicion, and yet discipline held. The same men who had stormed Iwo Jima and Okinawa now guarded enemy civilians with measured restraint. Military police ensured that all POWs, including women, were processed according to the Geneva Convention, despite Japan never having fully ratified it during the war. To many soldiers, this was redemption. To the Japanese, it was revelation. In the ruins of defeat, the moral power of the victors rested not in the barrel of a gun, but in the quiet dignity of restraint. The leadership angle. MacArthur's vision, MacArthur's approach to post-war. Japan was more than military policy. It was social engineering on a civilizational scale. He believed Japan could be rebuilt, not destroyed. And that transformation had to begin with symbols that ordinary people could see and feel. When reports reached his headquarters of American troops offering food and soap to surrendered women, he approved them as acts of peace. MacArthur also ensured that American women, nurses, clerks, and members of the Women's Army Corps played visible roles in humanitarian operations. This was not coincidence. He knew that female presence softened the image of occupation and challenged Japan's patriarchal assumptions. In Japanese culture, the image of a woman offering aid to a fallen enemy carried deep emotional weight. It evoked compassion without humiliation. The very act of a female American soldier handing a towel to a Japanese nurse blurred the boundaries between victor and vanquished. Under MacArthur's supervision, the occupation became less about retribution and more about re-education. Schools were reopened. Censorship shifted from militarist propaganda to democratic values. The emperor himself, once divine, was now a symbol of peace. And in the quiet corners of hospitals and relief centers, the gestures of American compassion reinforced that message far more effectively than speeches or decrees ever could. The historical angle, from enemies to allies in hindsight, historians see those first humanitarian gestures as the seeds of one of history's most unlikely alliances. Within a decade of Japan's surrender, the two nations that had fought one of the most brutal wars in history would become economic and political partners. American aid flowed into Japan, fueling reconstruction and industrial revival. By the 1950s, Japan was a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in Asia, a shield against communism, and later, a model of post-war recovery. But alliances are not built only on treaties. They are built on trust, and trust often begins with a single human act. When Japanese women received soap and towels from their former enemies, they also received a message: you will not be erased. You will be restored. This was more than charity. It was the first building block of reconciliation. The moral impact of that moment rippled across generations. Even decades later, survivors recalled the shock of that first kindness. Some described it as the instant they realized that Japan's defeat was not the end of their nation, but the beginning of its rebirth. The symbolic angle, cleansing the war itself in war, symbols matter as much as victories. Soap, towels, water, these were not weapons. Yet in 1945, they became tools of transformation. For the Americans, they represented order emerging from chaos, the ability to remain humane after years of unimaginable violence. For the Japanese, they represented purification, the washing away of shame, surrender, and sorrow. In both meanings, they marked the end of one kind of world and the birth of another. When historians speak of the clean surrender of Japan, they often refer to the orderly transition of power and the absence of mass resistance. But on a deeper level, the phrase captures something more intimate: the collective cleansing of a people from the stains of fanaticism and fear. That cleansing did not happen in a single day. It began quietly with acts so small they might have gone unnoticed. A towel handed across a language barrier, a bar of soap placed in shaking hands. Those gestures did not erase the crimes or the pain of war. But they did something equally vital. They allowed both sides to begin remembering each other as human beings again. The world had turned a corner. The era of destruction was ending, and the era of rebuilding had begun. But before peace could truly take root, both nations would face one final, defining confrontation, not on the battlefield, but in the moral reconstruction of Japan itself. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay. On the deck of the USS Missouri, Japan's surrender became official. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched on parchment. The Second World War was over, but hundreds of miles away, in camps and hospitals across the Pacific, the real transformation, the moral turning point, was taking place quietly, one encounter at a time. At a temporary processing camp near Los Baños south of Manila, a convoy of Japanese women, nurses, typists, and auxiliaries arrived under military guard. Their uniforms were sun-bleached, their hair matted, their eyes blank from exhaustion. Some had walked for days to reach surrender points. Others had been found hiding in the jungle, surviving on rainwater and roots. The American medics who received them were equally weary. Many had endured years in Japanese prison camps, watching comrades die from starvation and beatings. Now they faced their former enemies, not as captors or victims, but as caretakers. The air was thick with silence. An army interpreter gave the order: "Line up for medical inspection. Show no fear. You will not be harmed." But fear was all the women had left. Some refused to disrobe for examination, clinging to torn uniforms like armor. Others bowed repeatedly, murmuring apologies in broken English. Then, an unexpected scene unfolded. A young American nurse stepped forward, Lieutenant Margaret Wilson, assigned to the 8th Army Medical Corps. She was barely 24, her own brother killed in Leyte, yet she moved with calm precision. She placed a basin on the ground, poured clean water, and unwrapped a bar of soap. Slowly, she demonstrated washing her own hands. Then she extended the soap to the nearest Japanese woman. The woman stared at it as if it were a weapon. Her hands shook. Then hesitantly she reached out. The nurse nodded once. The gesture was so small, yet in that moment something immense shifted. Others followed. Buckets of water were passed down the line. American and Japanese women washed side by side in silence. The only sound, the rhythmic splash of water, the soft scrape of soap. A few soldiers turned away, overwhelmed. A Red Cross officer later described the scene. No orders, no ceremony, just an unspoken understanding. Two enemies discovering they could be human again. When the Japanese women finished, they were given fresh linen garments. The reaction was instant. Quiet sobs, hands trembling, heads bowed low. Many wept into the fabric. That day, something beyond surrender had occurred. It was not the loss of a nation, but the recovery of its soul. News of these interactions began filtering back to Allied headquarters. Reports noted that Japanese prisoners, especially women, responded more quickly to humane treatment than to formal commands. Commanders recognized the psychological importance of these moments and began integrating similar humanitarian measures into post-surrender protocols across the Pacific. Soon, at camps in Okinawa, Saipan, and Singapore, American troops established hygiene stations for surrendering personnel. Female medical staff were prioritized to handle Japanese women to maintain dignity and avoid cultural violation. One after another, the myths of brutality collapsed. For the Japanese women, each day in the camp felt like living in contradiction. They had been taught to fear violation. Instead, they found organization, medical care, and even kindness. Their captors offered them towels, toothbrushes, and soap. Luxuries they hadn't seen in years. It was overwhelming. One nurse later told an interpreter, "When they gave me soap, I wanted to throw it away. I could not believe it was real. Then I realized they did not want to harm me. I cried until my hands were clean." Her words echoed across testimonies collected by historians decades later. But this was not sentimentality. It was strategy wrapped in compassion. The Allied powers understood that Japan's future stability depended on psychological reconstruction as much as physical rebuilding. The goal was to replace fear with trust, one human interaction at a time. Each bar of soap, each clean towel, each moment of restraint became part of a broader psychological campaign. One memo from SCAP headquarters described it simply: "To conquer Japan's heart, treat its people as human beings before they remember they were soldiers." That was not military doctrine. It was moral engineering. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, the Japanese delegation signed the instrument of surrender. Cameras flashed, pens moved, and the war that had consumed the world officially ended. But beyond the deck of that ship, on the shores and in the streets, a quieter battle was beginning. One not fought with weapons, but with willpower, empathy, and restraint. In the weeks following that historic morning, American occupation forces poured into Japan. Convoys rolled through the shattered gates of Yokohama and Tokyo, bringing food, medicine, and order. Yet what met them was not an army of resistance, but a people broken, hungry, frightened, and uncertain whether they still had a future. Everywhere ruins stretched to the horizon. Nearly 1/4 of Japan's urban landscape lay in ashes. Children scavenged through rubble. Old men bowed in silence as columns of foreign soldiers passed. And women, once factory workers, medics, and auxiliary officers, wandered between refugee shelters wearing remnants of their uniforms, their insignia cut away, their identities stripped. Among these were the female prisoners of war, not in chains, but in shock. When American soldiers first approached them, many of the women refused to look up. They bowed repeatedly, whispering apologies, expecting violence or mockery. Some even covered their faces, unwilling to meet the eyes of their captors. But instead of shouts or threats, they heard calm voices. Instead of boots and bayonets, they saw medics carrying boxes marked U.S. Army Medical Corps. Inside were small miracles: canned milk, soap, gauze, fresh towels, and packets of vitamins. One eyewitness, an interpreter named Haru Matsumoto, later described the moment vividly. "We thought we would be punished. Instead, they handed us soap and told us to wash." One woman began to cry because she had not seen clean water in months. For the American soldiers, it was routine humanitarian procedure. Hygiene and disease prevention were standard protocol. But for the Japanese women, those gestures carried a meaning no medical manual could describe. They were being allowed to cleanse, literally and spiritually, after years of war. At a processing station near Yokohama, U.S. Army nurses supervised one of the first organized bathing operations for female POWs. Photographs later showed the women standing quietly in line, clutching clean towels like sacred objects. The Americans enforced no humiliation, no harshness. They provided privacy screens, soap, and even permitted the women to keep the towels afterward, a gesture almost unthinkable under the rigid structure of the Japanese military. The reports from that day describe something that words struggle to capture: tears, silence, and an overwhelming sense of disbelief. Some women bowed so deeply that the nurses asked them to stand upright. Others whispered thanks through interpreters, their voices shaking. An American nurse, Lieutenant Margaret Holt, later wrote in her diary, "They were terrified of us. But when we smiled, some of them smiled back. I don't think any of us will ever forget that." For the U.S. command, these small interactions carried enormous importance. They weren't just about hygiene or compassion. They were about redefining the meaning of surrender itself. In previous wars, surrender had meant humiliation. In this war, the Allies sought something different, a peace built on moral authority. Every bar of soap given, every towel offered became a statement. That civilization had survived the barbarism of total war. MacArthur himself reinforced this tone in his early orders. He demanded that occupation troops conduct themselves with calm dignity and moral restraint. Any act of cruelty, he warned, would dishonor the very victory they had won. And so, across Japan, acts of mercy multiplied. In Osaka, soldiers helped rebuild hospitals. In Tokyo, American women distributed clothing to orphaned children. And in the smaller internment centers, Japanese women, once officers of an empire, were offered the same care as any other human being. The shock of such compassion spread quickly. Rumors circulated that the Americans were different from what wartime propaganda had described. "They are not devils," one captured nurse was heard whispering. "They are people." It was a simple realization, but it marked a psychological revolution. Still, the tension was fragile. In some camps, suspicion lingered. A few Japanese officers tried to maintain hierarchy even in captivity, forbidding lower-ranked women from accepting aid. But hunger and exhaustion eroded obedience faster than orders could enforce it. As women accepted food and soap from their captors, they were unknowingly participating in one of history's most powerful transformations, the moral disarmament of a nation. Night after night, the same scenes repeated. In dimly lit medical tents, women washed their hands and faces for the first time in months. Soldiers offered blankets, sometimes quietly leaving them near sleeping prisoners. There was no triumphalism, no mockery, only fatigue, and a shared, wordless understanding that the killing was over. And yet beneath that surface peace, both sides carried ghosts. Many of the Americans had fought in Bataan, Okinawa, or Iwo Jima. Some had lost comrades to Japanese brutality. Showing kindness required a strength that combat had never demanded of them. As one Marine later said, it was harder to offer a towel than to pull a trigger. But maybe that's what made it worth it. That moment, when mercy triumphed over vengeance, was the real turning point of Japan's surrender. Not the signatures on Missouri, not the flags raised over ruins, but the quiet exchange between enemy hands, one offering, the other trembling to accept. Because in that fragile act of humanity, the war truly ended. By late autumn 1945, the first chill had descended over the ruins of Japan. Food was scarce. Disease spread through the cities, and a defeated nation stood at the edge of collapse. But in the midst of that suffering, something unprecedented was taking root. Trust. The first encounters between American soldiers and Japanese women had started as careful, almost ceremonial exchanges, a bar of soap, a towel, a meal. But as days turned into weeks, those gestures began to ripple outward. At the Tokyo distribution centers, groups of Japanese women volunteered to assist the Allied nurses who had once been their captors. They translated, organized, and helped deliver medical aid to refugees. Their presence surprised everyone, not least the American officers who had doubted such cooperation was possible. Military photographers documented these moments, unsure of what they were witnessing. In one image, a young Japanese nurse helps an American Red Cross worker hand out blankets to children. The two women smile faintly, awkward, almost uncertain, but their shared expression speaks louder than any victory parade. It was the beginning of reconciliation, not through politics but through empathy. At Yokosuka Naval Base, another transformation unfolded. Hundreds of Japanese naval auxiliaries, once trained to serve the Imperial Fleet, were repurposed by U.S. logistics officers to clean hospitals and assist with civilian sanitation drives. These same women, who had once cared for wounded Japanese sailors, were now sterilizing American medical wards. To an outsider, it might have seemed like irony. But to those living it, it was rebirth. They were not being punished. They were being given purpose. A field report from October 1945 recorded the reaction of one former Japanese naval nurse. We had lost everything: home, family, nation. The Americans told us we could still serve life. I think that saved many of us from despair. Elsewhere, the U.S. military launched organized humanitarian programs. The Civilian Information and Education Section, CIE, operating under MacArthur's headquarters, began distributing pamphlets teaching hygiene, nutrition, and democratic values. Women, both Japanese and American, became the messengers of this new order. And while most of the world saw post-war Japan through the lens of geopolitics, on the ground the transformation was personal. In burned-out neighborhoods of Shinjuku, American female officers taught Japanese women how to care for infants with powdered milk. In Kyoto, U.S. medical teams opened clinics for displaced mothers and children. In Hiroshima, where the bomb's shadow still lingered, doctors worked alongside Japanese nurses to treat radiation sickness. These were not acts of charity alone, they were acts of healing on a scale humanity had never attempted before. But the most powerful change happened in perception. When the war ended, the Japanese word for enemy, ateki, had carried centuries of emotional weight. By the end of 1946, another phrase began to circulate quietly among civilians: omoiyari, empathy, or the ability to feel another's suffering. This shift was not imposed by propaganda or authority. It was born out of direct experience. Japanese women, many of whom had faced the brunt of war's devastation, began teaching their children that the Americans were no longer demons. They were people capable of kindness. For their part, many American soldiers, hardened by combat, admitted that the humility of the Japanese civilians affected them deeply. In letters home, some wrote of a strange peace they had never expected to feel. "We came here to occupy," one GI wrote from Tokyo in 1946, "but I think we're the ones being changed." Even so, beneath these acts of compassion, scars remained. There were still prisoners, still hunger, still the haunting memory of atrocities committed on both sides. But those early humanitarian exchanges, the soap, the towels, the food, we gave both nations something to hold on to, the possibility of forgiveness. Historians later called it the silent peace. It was not declared, not negotiated, and not celebrated. It simply existed, in the shared humanity of two peoples learning how to coexist. In this silence, a new kind of strength took shape. American officers noticed that Japanese civilians, especially women, began approaching soldiers voluntarily to help clean barracks, plant gardens, and rebuild schools. In Fukuoka, women repurposed military fabric to sew clothes for orphans. In Osaka, they opened communal kitchens to feed both Japanese and American children. Every act of cooperation carried symbolic weight. Each gesture said the same thing: the war is over. We will live again. For the Americans, these moments reaffirmed the purpose of victory. They had not destroyed Japan. They were helping it rise. For the Japanese, it was a rediscovery of dignity, not the false pride of empire, but the quiet strength of survival. And in this shared labor of rebuilding, the same women who had once bowed in fear now stood alongside their former enemies, heads held high, sleeves rolled, ready to begin again. The moral climax of the war was not fought in the skies or the seas, but here, in the ashes of a fallen empire, where two nations discovered that even in defeat, compassion could still win. From those camps and ruins, a new relationship was born, one that would reshape Asia and define the global order for decades to come. But before the world could witness Japan's rebirth, it had to face the consequences of everything that came before: the reckoning, the trials, and the fragile rebuilding of a nation once thought lost to darkness. The guns of the Pacific had fallen silent. But for millions, the war did not simply end. It lingered in memories, in scars, and in silence. When Japan officially surrendered on September 2, 1945, the world exhaled. Yet on the ground, peace looked nothing like victory. Cities lay flattened, food was scarce, and an entire nation stood stunned beneath the weight of defeat. Among the ruins, the women who had once been prisoners or auxiliaries emerged as the quiet backbone of recovery. In the first months of occupation, General Douglas MacArthur's administration recognized something profound. If Japan was to stand again, it would be through its women. For the first time in the country's history, women were granted full suffrage under the new constitution. By 1946, more than 13 million Japanese women voted, a revolutionary act in a nation that had once confined them to silence. MacArthur's policies, though politically strategic, also carried a symbolic message. The same women who had suffered through war, hunger, and captivity were now being told they had a voice, a say in how their country would be rebuilt. Meanwhile, the former prisoners, those who had endured the war in camps across Asia, faced their own complex aftermath. When American forces liberated the POW camps in Japan, they found women broken physically but unbroken in spirit. Reports from the Allied repatriation missions describe scenes of disbelief. American nurses who had been held captive since 1942 now being saluted by their rescuers. Dutch and Australian women embracing soldiers who offered them clean clothes, medicine, and warm food. One American officer wrote, "They had survived on almost nothing, but when we entered the camp, they smiled. Some even apologized for their appearance. I have never seen such dignity. For these women, soap and towels were not luxuries. They were symbols of humanity returning after years of degradation." At the same time, Japanese civilians, including the women who had served the imperial war machine, began to confront a new kind of guilt. For years, wartime propaganda had portrayed the enemy as inhuman, but now through the Allied occupation, they saw a different reality. Many of the female clerks, nurses, and communication aides who had once supported the military effort wrote in diaries and letters about the shock of kindness from American soldiers. They had been prepared for cruelty, but received compassion. That realization became one of the quiet revolutions of post-war Japan. In the broader landscape, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, 1946-1948, began prosecuting the architects of Japan's aggression. Women for the first time were allowed to testify about what they had endured, not as nameless victims, but as witnesses of history. Their testimonies revealed a reality often overshadowed by battle reports: the famine, the fear, the brutality of camp life, and the relief of liberation. For many of them, the moment an American soldier handed them soap or water wasn't just an act of rescue, it was the return of dignity stolen by war. While the trials sought justice, the rebuilding sought redemption. The U.S. occupation introduced sweeping social reforms. The abolition of state Shinto ended the fusion of religion and nationalism. The Land Reform Act broke the power of feudal landlords. The new education system encouraged critical thinking and equality, but perhaps the most transformative of all was cultural. The redefinition of womanhood in post-war Japan. American humanitarian groups, the Red Cross, the YWCA, and various church missions opened homes for war widows and orphaned girls. Japanese women were trained as teachers, midwives, and community leaders. And those who had once been POWs became advocates for peace, writing memoirs that shaped a generation's understanding of war. Still, recovery was not without conflict. In the shadows of Tokyo's brightening streets, black markets flourished. Hunger persisted. Some women turned to desperate means of survival, but the underlying current of moral awakening, born from that first compassion between enemy and captive, endured. By 1947, a quiet stability began to return. Factories reopened, schools filled with children again, newspapers printed stories of American doctors helping Japanese nurses reopen hospitals. The once unthinkable was now daily life and cooperation between two nations that had tried to destroy each other. It was fragile, imperfect, and sometimes forced. But it was real, and in that uneasy peace something remarkable was emerging: respect. As Japan entered its second year under occupation, the memory of those first gestures, soap, towels, kindness, remained powerful symbols. They represented the smallest yet most enduring victory of all, the victory of compassion over vengeance. But the world beyond Japan was changing rapidly. The Cold War was beginning, and new lines of power were forming. The fragile relationship between the former enemies would soon face new tests, not of war, but of loyalty and ideology. By 1948, Japan's wounds had begun to close, not fully, but enough for life to move again. Factories hummed softly where rubble once stood. Children walked to school in patched uniforms. The scent of rice, scarce for years, returned to village kitchens. But for thousands of women, soldiers, nurses, and civilians alike, recovery meant more than rebuilding homes. It meant reclaiming identity. The Allied occupation did not simply enforce political change. It redesigned Japan's social fabric. For the first time, women entered professions once reserved for men. Former army clerks became teachers. Ex-nurses worked in public health clinics alongside American medical teams. The act of receiving soap and towels, once a moment of humiliation turned to gratitude, became a metaphor for the cleansing of a nation, a slow moral reconstruction. In Tokyo, American humanitarian offices distributed hygiene kits, vitamins, and educational pamphlets. They taught not only sanitation but self-worth. The small rituals of cleanliness, washing one's face, combing hair, dressing properly, took on symbolic power in a culture that prized order and purity. To many Japanese women, these gestures were not foreign impositions. They were bridges back to dignity. Among the occupation forces, American women played a distinct role. Members of the Women's Army Corps, the Red Cross, and missionary nurses often worked directly with Japanese civilians. Their reports, archived in the U.S. National Archives, describe scenes of quiet transformation. American nurses training Japanese midwives in postnatal care. Former Japanese officers attending sewing classes beside war widows. Children lining up at community centers to receive soap, chocolate, and school books. The emotional distance between the two nations began to shrink, not through treaties but through these small, human exchanges. Yet beneath this cooperation, a subtle cultural shift was underway. Japanese women were discovering independence. For centuries, the Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, had been the standard of virtue. But in post-war classrooms and offices, a new idea was spreading. The woman as citizen, thinker, and equal American educators, such as Beta Sirota Gordon, helped draft Article 24 of Japan's new constitution, guaranteeing equality in marriage and family law. For millions of Japanese women, this was revolutionary. But the emotional turning point had come earlier, in those moments of surrender, when American soldiers treated them not as enemies but as humans. The irony of history was clear. The same power that had bombed their cities was now helping them heal. In interviews decades later, many Japanese women would recall that paradox. They did not forget the war, the hunger, or the fear, but they remembered vividly the day an American soldier handed them soap, or smiled or offered a towel to wash away the grime of years. For them, that moment became a symbol not of defeat, but of rebirth. By 1950, the world had changed again. The Cold War had begun, and Japan, once a bitter enemy, became a crucial ally in America's Pacific strategy. Factories that once produced weapons now made textiles and electronics. The United States encouraged Japan's rapid industrial recovery, viewing stability as the best defense against communism. And through it all, women remained at the center of Japan's quiet transformation. The nurses who had once served the Imperial Army became leaders in public health. Former POWs helped found organizations advocating for peace and humanitarian aid. Some joined the early United Nations relief efforts, working side by side with those who had once been their captors. History had turned a full circle, not through politics, but through shared humanity. By the mid-1950s, the image of Japan abroad had shifted completely. No longer the empire of militarism, it became a model of resilience and cooperation. Tokyo's streets glittered with electric light once more, and the American occupation formally ended in 1952. But among the countless stories of recovery, one memory persisted, that of women who, broken by war, had found compassion in their former enemies. In diaries, memoirs, and interviews recorded decades later, many of them spoke not of military defeat but of personal redemption. One wrote simply, "When I was given soap by an American soldier, I did not see an enemy. I saw forgiveness." Those words captured the quiet soul of post-war Japan, a nation that cleansed itself not only with water and work, but with humility. As peace settled permanently across the Pacific, the world turned toward rebuilding and remembrance. But in the hearts of those who had survived, and especially the women, the lesson endured. That compassion, shown even in the smallest gesture, can change the course of history, and from that understanding would grow a new alliance, one built not on victory or surrender, but on shared humanity. History often records wars through numbers, casualties, battles, and treaties. But the true aftermath of war lives not in ledgers, but in gestures. For Japan and the United States, the Pacific conflict had been one of the most brutal in modern history. Cities turned to ash, lives extinguished beyond count, hatred taught as duty. Yet when the fighting ended, it wasn't a treaty that healed the wounds. It was compassion. The image of American soldiers handing out soap and towels may seem small compared to the scale of destruction. But to those who lived it, the starving nurses, the disoriented prisoners, the women stripped of status and hope, it meant everything. It was a moment that redefined the meaning of victory, because in that exchange neither side stood as conqueror or conquered. They stood simply as human beings. The rebuilding of Japan that followed, its democracy, its education system, its rise from ruins to prosperity, began not just with industry, but with empathy. The women who once wept at the offer of soap went on to educate, to lead, to raise a new generation untouched by imperial ambition. They carried forward the quiet wisdom born of war, that cruelty may command obedience, but kindness commands change. In the decades that followed, as Japan became one of America's strongest allies, few could have imagined that such peace had begun with something as simple as an act of mercy in a prisoner camp. Yet that is the enduring truth of history, that sometimes the smallest kindness can end the longest war. And so, in the story of those women, their tears, their silence, their awakening, we find the rarest victory of all, the victory of humanity itself.